Uh, Maybe not. What's up, guys? All about here, and here we are to do a breakdown and discussion on whether or not the Infinity has any sort of downsides at all, or if it is quite literally a perfect ability. Notably, this isn't how good is the Infinity actually. We'll talk about that separately in its own Limitless video, considering the Infinity is simply just a sub-technique of the Limitless, and you know that Limitless video is going to be like 15 years long. So I just want to cover the Infinity individually, especially considering the main user of the Infinity kind of got infinite cut down. So we have a decent chunk to talk about, so let's not waste any more time and let's hop right into it. So the Infinity, also known as the neutral application of the Limitless, also known as an extension of Blue, also known as the thing that allowed Satoru Gojo to not just become one of the most popular characters and most powerful characters in his own series, but also one of the most popular characters and a quite powerful character in versus debates across the entire anime manga community and even transcending into other fandoms. I've seen Gojo versus Percy Jackson. If you want to know my thoughts on that, let me know down below. I actually wouldn't mind doing that versus battle, though I think you may know the answer. But with that being the case, the Infinity itself is actually just quite simple. It is just the manifestation of an impossibility. Yeah, I know it doesn't sound simple, but in concept, okay, let me not lie. In concept, it's still quite complicated, but in execution, it's actually not too complicated at all. So it's the manifestation of the Achilles and the tortoise paradox, where essentially there is an infinite distance between two objects, no matter what. No matter how hard, no matter how difficult you try to be, there's absolutely no way for you to come in contact with another thing, because there's always a space that is infinitely in between you and your opponent. And the way the Limitless manifests this is a quote-unquote barrier that surrounds the wielder of the Limitless when the technique is activated. This barrier doesn't actually like defend, legally speaking. What it does is it slows down everything that comes in contact with the hypothetical user of the Infinity. The reason we know this is not an actual like barrier that like defends things is because we rarely see things like bounce off of it, nor really like deal with it in the way that a typical barrier or shield or wall would. The Infinity, since it's a manifestation of Achilles and the tortoise, slows down objects infinitely. So it may appear that objects may just, I don't know, slowly slide or slowly grind against the, that sounds so wrong, but legitimately, while objects may appear to slowly grind or slide against it, it doesn't really do all too much in terms of actually reaching the opponent. And that's what makes the ability, in my opinion, very, very good. Because essentially, any attack that travels, any attack, whether it be a slash, whether it be a punch, whether it be a kick, whether it be something as dangerous or diabolical as, I don't know, maybe hypothetically a massive meteor, it all doesn't really matter when in regards to the Infinity, because it simply allows the wielder to kind of just sit there and watch it. And notably, the upper limits of this ability in terms of what it can actually slow down and stop have never been truly explored, just due to the nature of Jujutsu Kaisen as a series. Since it is the manifestation of an impossible concept, people have been able to take the Infinity to ludicrous levels, insane levels so far beyond levels that it's actually quite concerning to think about. Because, well, unless you are able to break an impossibility, something that sounds fundamentally impossible, squared, then you shouldn't be able to breach the Infinity. And it basically is one of the biggest reasons why Gojo Satoru was relevant in versus battles a lot, even before the verse towards its back half started to get massive juicy amps, such as electromagnetic waves, black holes, cleaving the world. Like, there's a whole bunch of different things that are happening in the back half of the series, but well before this back chunk of the series where characters are getting much better, much greater, and much crazier feats, the Infinity alone is what allowed Satoru to transcend. And the reason I say the ability has basically no downsides when being used is for the fact that outside of its extreme energy expenditure, if you are not also a 6-size wielder and you are also not Satoru Gojo, it doesn't really have any negative effects on the wielder, and simply negates almost everything that your opponent can do. The only things that should hypothetically transcend the Infinity are attacks that do not travel, attacks that activate within the opponent, which sounds weird, but we're going to get into that, and or attacks that simply delete impossibilities or affect things that the infinity exists in. Because due to the nature of the infinity being a concept brought into reality, it makes it so that even though it's a fundamental impossibility, it still does exist now. And if things exist, they can be wiped from that very same existence. So what do I mean? When you come to the infinity, it is obviously pretty much the ultimate defensive technique, right? And when specifically put in the hands of someone like Satoru Gojo, someone with the 6 eyes, which allow for extreme optimal use of cursed energy, essentially an unlimited amount of cursed energy, and also someone like Gojo who has RCT, who can basically turn off the brain drain effect of constantly having the infinity on that we see he has in his youth, I mean, it's basically unstoppable, right? Like, there's nothing you can really do against it. Oh no, you can no longer hit your opponent. Good luck, I guess. Nice chance trying to hit him. And with that being the case, there are still some downsides to the infinity, despite how good it is, and despite the version of it we're referring to is the one being used by Satoru Gojo, because unfortunately we just do not have another example of it. The Gojo clan in of itself is a super large mystery within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen. We don't know if the rest of them exist. Supposedly they do. Gojo did have to be born, but outside of fan works, there's pretty much no indication of any other Gojo clan member. We just know someone similar to Gojo exists in the past. We know people in the past have had the limitless technique because it's well known enough about that it's not a complete mystery. But there still are the downsides. Downside number 1. If you are still not strong enough to damage your opponent, the infinity is not going to help you. So essentially, you can be put in a stalemate situation where all of your attacks are absolutely worthless. And all of your opponent's attacks are absolutely worthless. And it just comes out to a game of like, oh, well, who has the longer lifespan? It's an issue that Satoru runs in when he's going super cross-verse and he's like going up against characters who kind of have resistance to information manipulation and matter erasure. Because then it's just two people not being able to hit each other. The infinity has no offensive utility alone. Maybe ? Explanation point. And this is where we go into the idea of why I'm worried that it has no downsides. Because we see only once in the entire series, which is a little concerning, we see that Satoru Gojo can utilize the infinity as not just a, defensive barrier, but he can also use it to kind of just press people. And not in the sense that you press people with physical attack. No, he can just make the barrier stronger and bigger and make it just a big old bubble. And depending on how he uses said bubble, he can crush people with it. Now, admittedly, we don't know how this would work in an open area. So you were to put, Satoru Gojo in a blank void with somebody else, and he were to attempt to use the Infinity Crush, it's very likely that it wouldn't work all too well. This is most likely why we don't see him use it at all in the battle against Sukuna, despite the fact that it would be very, very useful to use. But with that being the case, that hypothetical no offense downside isn't really even a downside, because you can use it offensively. It just requires some pretty specific setup and may or may not be able to be countered by people with enough raw power to counter your abilities. But speaking of counters to the infinity, the reason it still kind of counts as a no downside thing is because one of its built-in downsides within its own series, domain amplification, the ability to shut down other curse techniques by absorbing them, slurping them up. Yeah, if you're just strong enough and you have enough juice, and Gojo Satoru will always have enough juice, the infinity will be able to just bully through that and kind of just beats it up no matter what. We see this when Jogo and Hanami go to use domain amplification on Satoru Gojo, and he's like, okay, so I usually keep the infinity at like a low-level barrier around me, but I can just put more juice into it. And essentially, it turns off the fact that you turned off the infinity. If that doesn't sound stupid, it is. But then that becomes the question of, well, does that mean that Gojo Satoru is broken, which he is? Or does that mean that the infinity is broken because you can always just turn it up? And considering the fact that the range can be expanded to not just include Satoru Gojo himself, but seemingly quite the wide area, and this tangible area does seem to have a opposite attraction force, which is weird, right? Because the infinity is an application of blue, but blue is attraction. But when you come to the infinity is kind of a repellent kind of thing when it's used offensively. It's strange, but once again, it goes into the idea that the infinity kind of has no drawbacks. But of course, drawbacks are not necessarily immunities, and drawbacks aren't necessarily weaknesses, because the Infinity does have some weaknesses, which is why I do think it is somewhat balanced within the world of Jujutsu Kaisen and Crossverse naturally. Weakness number one. You can just turn it off. And I know that sounds stupid, right? Because I literally just mentioned how Gojo can turn up the level of the barrier. Yeah, it's never really implied that if he's facing a relative opponent that he can kind of just brute force it. Notably, it seems to only work on people that are weaker, because once again, he does not use that tactic against Sukuna at all. Even when he's in the case of his own domain expansion, where hypothetically expanding the Infinity to counter domain implication would have been really, really useful. But considering Sukuna and him were relative in stats, it appears that the implication of the Infinity is still super duper limited, to the point where Gojo cannot simply expand, and immediately negate any ability to turn it off. And notably, while in Jujutsu Kaisen, the ability to turn off other abilities is quite rare, in the grand scheme of fiction, it kind of isn't. You have characters like Zeldris, someone with the Demon King's power, who can kind of just walk up to Gojo and smack him because, well, he has the Demon King's power, which turns off all other techniques when it comes into contact with it. And we know, we've seen it in the series itself, that the Infinity, despite its extreme power, when faced with something that kind of just turns things off, such as the Inverted Spear of Heaven, well, the Infinity can still get turned off, and thusly that weakness is always viable. It's to the point where Satoru Gojo, even after awakening, and even after getting a mastery of the Infinity to the point where he can just do it automatically, still went out of his way to destroy the Inverted Spear of Heaven and the Black Rope, because there was something that could actively interfere with his technique, no matter how powerful he made it, no matter how much juice he tried to put behind it, no matter how overwhelmingly powerful he was, those things can work against them, which essentially means that any character with the ability to turn off other characters' abilities, as long as they're able to come in contact with the Infinity, they will turn it off. And it appears that the Infinity kind of has a bubble effect, or it comes to the point where if the Infinity is shut off, well, to say the very least, the whole thing disappears. So hypothetically, when you punch through the Infinity, or stab through it, or pierce through it, the whole thing kind of pops like a soap bubble, and then bada bing bada boom, you could damage Satoru until he turns the technique back on. Another thing is, I mentioned this earlier, attacks that don't travel, or attacks that specifically act internally to the opponent through some sort of means and metric. So for the first one, attacks that don't travel, there are numerous cases, admittedly not in Jujutsu Kaisen, but I'm lying, specifically in Jujutsu Kaisen, where sure hits of domain expansions, they don't travel. They just appear. And notably, we see this work specifically against the Infinity, to the point where despite the fact that these attacks appear in the area, and we've seen some domain sure hits actually seemingly travel, it doesn't matter. If a domain has a sure hit that is lethal, it will land on Satoru Gojo. We very specifically see this from the level in Shrine, and this naturally means that any attacks that do not travel will bypass the Infinity, and once you are reached, the Infinity is worthless. It does not buff Satoru Gojo's innate durability. It does not do anything for him. If your attacks are able to reach him past the Infinity, well, that's all she wrote. It's pretty unfortunate. Another thing is, certain attacks that may or may not travel, if they have certain properties, the Infinity can still most certainly be breached. The most famous example of this is the one that took Satoru Gojo's life, the World Cleave, the Spatial Slash, the Deadly Dismantle, Sukuna's evolution, born of Maharaga's adaptation of Sukuna's technique against Satoru Gojo. It was a spatial manipulation attack, an existence erasure attack that simply deleted the space that Satoru Gojo existed in. And since the Infinity is an application of space manipulation, and it does by proxy exist despite being an impossibility that isn't meant to exist, if you have a spatial manipulation attack, even if that attack travels, as long as it deletes the space that somebody's in, well, bada bing, bada boom, the Infinity isn't really going to be able to defend you, because unfortunately the Infinity is a concept brought into reality, meaning it's there, meaning it can get cut, meaning the Infinity is basically worthless. So overall, what do I think about the Infinity? Does it have any innate drawbacks? Does it have any downsides? Not in of itself. It is a technique when coming to defensive utility is pretty much impossible to beat. The only better technique defensively is a technique that defends you on every single level. Like a technique that would literally turn off anything and everything that would come in contact with you, or shut down or negate, or even inverse the effects of any attacks that would come to you. That's the only thing that's hypothetically better than Infinity, but that's about it. I wouldn't call that a drawback. I just say that's a lack of a need for improvement. And for weaknesses, it does have a couple. And I think that's what balances the Infinity, right? A lot of things within Jujutsu Kaisen, at least 3 separate things, are built in order to shut down, well, really, like 4 or 5, darn near 6 separate things. When you have Angel's Technique, when you have Miguel's Black Rope, when you have the Inverse Spear of Heaven, when you have Domain Amplification, when you have Domain Sure Hits, and you have the World Cleave. Yeah, the Infinity, while extremely powerful, does not stand invincible within its own series, not to talk of the rest of fiction itself. However, that's what I think. Please leave what you guys think in the comment section down below. If you went all the way to the end of this video, please leave Infinity's End in the comment section down below. I want to thank you guys so much for watching once again. Please remember to leave a like, share, comment, and subscribe, and make sure you hit that little notification bell so you do not miss out on any videos that come to the channel. Also, I do have a Patreon down below where you support for as low as $1 a month. Get things like exclusive videos, early content, and more. You can also now become a member of the channel for as low as $3 a month to get the same perks and more. Some of those perks will include the live reaction to the next chapter of Jujutsu Kaisen. Now, I want to thank you guys so much for watching once again, and I hope you guys have a wonderful day. This is that guy with the pencil, writing off. I'd like to give a thank you to our $3 members, Connor Plays, Red Wolf 4765, and Greyhound. I'd like to give another thank you to our $5 patrons, Winter, Victor, Sean, Midnight Gemlord, Kevin, and Demix LND. I'd like to give a scrumptious thank you to our $7 member, Autumn's Morning Lazo. I'd like to give another chunka-dunka thank you to our $10 patrons, Robbie Uchiha, Joaquin, and Idem Okami. I'd like to give another thank you to our $25 member, Alex Ice Rose. I'd like to give a hefty thank you to our two $25 patrons, Calvin Elder and Igneel.